Welcome, everybody. We are here with another episode of Timeless Dialogues, where we try to take timeless issues and make them into current dialogues and see the relevance for current dialogues in today's situation. And we have a special guest with us today. His name is Anderson O'Campo. Did I say that right, Anderson?
You did.
All right. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure. And he's going to be joining us all the way from Colombia, South America. And what we're going to do is we're going to discuss the Reformation of churches in South America, in particular, the importance it has not only for Colombia, but the entire continent. So again, Anderson, I want to thank you for coming on here today. And I think our guests are really going to appreciate all the things that you're going to have to say.
Well, Bill, I appreciate, thank you for having me. It's been a long time since we don't see each other in person, and I'm happy to share this space with you right now. I think this is relevant issues for the church, and I hope this is helpful for people who will watch this video.
I'm sure it will be. I think one of the hardest things with having sort of COVID and then also, having to fly to get to one another is just having that distance. I found my time in Colombia with you to be just such an enjoyable experience. And unfortunately, we're sometimes separated by the body of Christ by oceans and land, but we know that there's true unity in the body of Christ. In fact, that's how I first met Anderson. I was asked to go speak and teach at a school outside of Medellin, and he was an individual who I first met at a church, actually. And I just remember, when you go to different churches in a foreign country, you're always trying to deal with the language barrier. And you never know how much English or whatever language the other person is speaking, how much they actually know. And Anderson came up to me and I had the same question. And he was like, I'm good. Just speak normally. I'll be fine. And that's because one thing is that Anderson actually does a phenomenal job translating for teachers and different publications. In fact, if anybody out there is looking for somebody to do real translation work, I highly recommend Anderson. And one thing that we're going to do is we're going to put his contact information where you can get a hold of him in the comments and dialogue section below so that you have a way of reaching out for your further ministries. And what we're going to do here is we're going to kind of do this interview in two different parts. We're going to have a get to know you section with Anderson, and then we're going to get into some very specific interview questions. So some of these get to know you are short questions that we try to get rapid answers to, just to try to understand who you are. Some are a little personal, some are funny. So Anderson, tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, your family, and just a little bit about who you are.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bill, for that introduction. Yeah, I am. I live in Colombia. I'm from Colombia. I live all my life in Medellin. Medellin is one of the main cities in Colombia. It's part of a big state. We call it department, but it's a big state called Antioquia. And I'm a Christian since I am 15 years old. So it's like 20 years now. I am married. I'm gonna be 9 years married. I've got 2 children. Me and my wife, Tatiana, we homeschooled them. It's been maybe 8 years now. So yeah, and I've been working for American companies for a while, maybe nearly 10 years or so. I've got some experience translating books, articles, some videos, and interpretation in conferences at churches, and some experience in seminar.
Yeah, in fact, Anderson, you were one of my translators for my apologetics course that we had a few years ago. And, you say you have some experience. I think you have quite a bit of experience. That's one of the things is that when you're looking at different disciplines, to study apologetics or philosophy, you have to learn a vocabulary to do it in your own language, more or less in another language. And about as fast as I could say it, Anderson could translate it. So he always did a great job with it. Now, here's a question I have about Medellin. So when you fly into Medellin, it's like flying into a bowl and you land kind of in the bottom of that bowl. What's the elevation of Medellin? I mean, how high up is it?
It's 5,000 feet.
That's a lot. Now, is the school significantly higher than Medellin? Because I know we have to drive way up in the mountains.
I think it is. I think it's probably 3,000 feet or so, the school. It's 50 minutes from Medellin. Interesting from Medellin is, like you say, it's a vault. And whenever you're driving, if you get lost, you just say, we used to say, just start going down and you'll get there.
Eventually, you're going to make your way down.
Yeah,
Now,
yeah.
here's the funny thing is that where I grew up, it was in the Midwest in Iowa here in the United States, and it's flat. It's very flat.
Mm,
And we took the Metro Cable one time all the way from the top to the bottom. And when you're used
yeah,
to growing up in a flat area, taking some little thing like that, it was like, oh my goodness, am I going to fall out of this? Because you're
yeah.
so high up within Medellin. Now, here's an interesting thing. I know some people know this and maybe others don't. Who's the most famous figure to come from Medellin?
Well, yeah, that's an interesting and dangerous question. All right, but I'll be honest with you. I'll be honest with you. We have interesting figures coming from Medellin, like former President Alvaro Uribe. He's very popular, very famous, and back in the day, he got really good relationship with George Bush and so on. And he was very well known for the war and his policy on with the guerrilla. But definitely, and just so you know, this culture has changed a lot since 30 years ago. It's not the same. Our city is not the same. It's totally different. But I'm afraid that most famous figure in Medellin is Pablo Escobar.
Yeah. Didn't
Yeah,
you grow up kind of in near one of the communities where he had a lot of influence as a kid?
yeah,
Didn't you tell me that?
yeah. As a matter of fact, I'm from Envigado. Envigado is a city 30 minutes from Medellin. And in Envigado was his prison. If you know, maybe back in the early 90s, there was a deal between him and the government in that time, and he had a prison in the mountains.
Oh, wow.
And it was, I remember, probably I was 5 years old. I remember the helicopters and soldiers running, and the patrols and the cars because he escaped. And I recall one of the neighbors
Wow.
saying, "You know what? If he comes by here, I will hide him in my house." So that was part of the culture. People were more in favor of him. Um, so that's an interesting story. I remember when I was a kid, but he had a lot of influence back in that city. But in Medellin itself, in downtown, it's still part of many young people. They got stickers in the motorcycles, they had t-shirts, there are paintings drawing the walls in the city. Some young people just still this, like he's an admirable person for them.
Isn't it so interesting to see how these figures, whether good or bad, can have just such long-term effects on
Oof.
each city? I mean, every city has that. We can think of one place that I used to live, which was Chicago, Illinois. And they say in Chicago there's only two types of people, the quick and the dead. And that's because of so much gang activity that goes on. But one of their big figures there was Al Capone, who was a,
Yeah.
a world-renowned gangster mobster in that sense. And people always wonder that. And cities change, but
Yeah.
you in many ways you learn a lot about life when you have to grow up in a community that
Yeah.
has these big figures. It shapes the culture in so
And
many
I think in
ways.
a way, yeah, as you say, it shapes the culture, it shapes the language. Some phrases, the way we speak, are references to how they used to speak about their own deals, their
Yeah.
own stuff.
Now, let me change the subject here. Just a couple more of
Yeah.
these as we're going. So, a few years ago, you and I went to some town. I don't remember really where it was. I just remember getting in the car and getting out of the car where we went to this Reformed Baptist church somewhere.
Yeah.
Which city was that in?
That city is called Carmen de Viboral. Carmen de Viboral. It's some of a snake, Viboral or Vibora, and it's probably an hour or so from Medellin. It's a beautiful colonial town, and it's very well known for the ceramics. They manufacture the craftsmanship of
They were everywhere. I
ceramics
remember everywhere we went, the streets had
everywhere.
ceramics, the sidewalks.
Yeah,
And I thought to myself, if it starts raining out here, how do people actually walk? Because, tile's slick. And if you have to get away from something, or if a car has to stop, I'm like, oh my goodness, you're toast, when you're out there. Now, correct me if I'm wrong. Isn't that town it's a very highly well-known Roman Catholic town, but wasn't that church one of the first sort of Reformed churches or even Protestant churches that was planted in that area that we went to?
Yeah, there are some Christian churches in that area, but I believe, as far as I know, that's the first Reformed Baptist church in the area. And as it happens, the guy who is the pastor right now is a former student in the school. We work together, so that's pretty good.
And that's some of what we actually want to talk about today, is how you've worked with schools and trying to get people into different ministries. But here's the real question. I kind of added this one to our list before I sent it to you. This is the central question, just in case he ends up watching this. So when Rob Coleman visited Colombia, was he any good at soccer or not? Was he just, could join the soccer team for the national team, or was he less than favorable for it? Be honest now.
Well, Rob,
we love you, Rob. We love you, Rob.
Yeah, we love you a lot. Well, I'll tell you this. Number one, he was very passionate teaching his biblical theology class. Really loved it. Number two, I think he's really good into soccer. Yeah.
Okay. So maybe, Rob, there's still hope for you. We'll just have to work you up through the different systems that are there. Yeah. So let's dive into some of these questions here. And what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss sort of worldview and apologetics and what that looks like for the Reformation of churches in South America. So, Anderson, how did you get involved and interested in theology and worldview studies and apologetics? Given where you grew up and your access to literature, how did you even get exposed to it?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned earlier, I've been a Christian for 20 years, but in my 10th year, I started in a Pentecostal charismatic church, and I've been really very passionate about reading. And one of the ways I wanted to improve my English was by reading in English. Okay, and that includes listening and all you need to learn to have a good fluency in English. But I got this job working for an American company from Medellin, and most of the guys, it was a very small team, but most of the guys were atheists. Okay, so I was very passionate to evangelize them and share my faith, and I believe for the first time in my life, they were mocking at it. They were laughing at it, at my face, about my faith, about Christ, about Jesus and everything. And they were bringing these arguments that God doesn't exist, the problem, stuff with the evil in the world and so on. And I was very, very frustrated. I was confused, puzzled, like, Lord, I'm sure I'm saying the right things. Why they don't convert? Why they don't accept Jesus? And that's how it started the seed to in my search and research about answering that question, why they do not believe when I'm saying the right things. And then mixing that with my interest in improving my English, I discovered John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul. And so I listened to this sermon from John MacArthur, why we believe, why others reject. And that hits. I felt that fits in what was in my brain.
So was that a big reason how you kind of came out of maybe the Pentecostal movement? Was that like an influential means for you coming out of it?
It was. I had practically 1 feet out of the Pentecostal movement. But yeah, I think in order to face those arguments in my job and overcome these arguments, these fallacies, I became more interested in theology and apologetics. I pretty much started with R.C. Sproul, actually.
I can't tell you how many people I know whose interest in apologetics and biblical studies, especially here, even in the United States, my interest in those really started because of John MacArthur and R.C. Sproul and the influence that they had. when you look at apologetics, I think a lot of people have a very similar experience. They either
Yeah.
need to find answers or they feel like they need to stop sharing their faith. And they realize that if they're going to stop evangelizing people with the gospel, well, that's not a biblical option. That's not something that we're commanded and permitted to do in scripture. So then we're, driven to the text of scripture to answer their questions. We're driven to apologetics.
Yeah.
Now, is there anything that you think may be unique in South America, like apologetic issues that people need to address that maybe we wouldn't face here in the United States of America?
Yeah. Yeah. Before I answer that, I want to finish that story because 4 years later, when I was finishing the term in that business, um, I I was a total different man, prepared, engaging and more able to articulate my faith. And one of these guys that he actually tried to be very consistent because he used to drink a lot. He told me, and he kind of recognized this. He said, Anderson, actually I was just mocking. I don't know anything about anything. I was just and I said,
I'm
oh,
just going
thank you.
along with it. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
keep the convo going. Yeah.
Exactly. So
We run
yeah,
into
and
that a lot too. You get to the end of it and you'll ask people, you're like, do you really know what you're talking about? They're like, no, I just wanted to see how far
yeah.
I could keep you.
So
But
but
God uses those conversations.
he used that guy, and I still pray for him. So now, in terms of apologetics, it's interesting to note that we don't have the atheism problem here in that big scale like in the U.S. or Europe, because Colombia is still a Catholic country. So actually, Richard Dawkins was here a couple of years ago, and he debated with a priest. Terrible debate, but that to say that during the debate, he said this is a Christian country. Well, it's not, but it's mostly Catholic country. So
Where
most
did
of
they
the
debate at? Which school was that at again?
that was a Catholic school actually.
Was it in Bogota?
Don't re-
Where?
I think it was Bucaramanga.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
I remember you telling me about it. It was at one of the bigger schools there in Colombia. And
yeah.
so if it's not atheism, then what is the bigger issues that people, or what are the bigger issues people face there?
See, usually it is the Catholic stuff, um, worshiping idols, the mass, um, that kind of thing is mostly the big deal in terms of apologetics.
So if
But to
somebody
me
wants to go
right
to
now,
South America, they really need to brush up on their Catholic
yeah,
apologetics and issues related to it. Sorry, I cut you off. What
yeah,
were you going to say? Now it's a
yes, yeah, that's true. That's totally true. And the thing is that Catholic priests are very well equipped philosophically and theologically versus pastors. So that's one thing. Catholic is a required field for apologetics. But right now, from my perspective, and I think we're going to touch on that later, it's the worldview stuff. I think the Christian church in general doesn't have a biblical worldview. There's a mix, and you know, people like Marxism and socialism and that thing, abortion and other stuff. So I
See,
think that's another.
that's really interesting that you bring that up because, the United States of America, we historically have not been a Marxist or a socialist country. But now, if you go to a college campus, you might as well, look at a sign as you're crossing the line that says you are now leaving the United States and entering into the Socialist Republic of the University of fill in the blank. And it's
Hmm,
because our college campuses are just bastions of liberalism and socialism. And we've got all these movements that are taking place. And it's just changed the landscape here.
yeah.
But how have you seen, probably for the vast majority of your lifetime, Marxism and socialism have had a significant influence in
Oof.
Colombia? How has that
Yeah.
affected churches and how you do ministry and worldview studies?
Yeah. Well, but years ago, well, first of all, Colombia has been in war practically forever, but with the guerrilla for about 60 years, to be fair. And I remember when I was in Pentecostal church, there was a big war with the guerrilla. They were killing a lot of pastors and Catholic priests, the
Mm.
guerrilla. And the media doesn't speak about a lot about that, but they used to kill a lot of Christian ministers. Now, how does that affect the church? I think that, well, back in the day, uh, people couldn't drive freely throughout the country because the guerrilla would stop and kidnap people. Now that's not the case. Now we can do it freely and go, many places around across the country. Actually, that's why there's many North American missions right now in the country. But I believe that in part the Trojan horse that I believe has contributed to affecting the church is education, because education is practically controlled by the left, by the guerrilla. And now younger generations are ready to accept a leftist or socialistic president. Because number one, because they don't know the history, they don't know the war, the bloodshed, the kidnapping in the 80s and 90s. And second, because they want everything for free, university free, more jobs, you name it,
And it
you
sounds
know about all
exactly
this
like what's
stuff.
going on here in the United States. Re-educate them in the
Right.
schools and give them everything for free. And for some reason, they keep voting for it, and they don't get any of the return on that investment. And now,
Yeah.
what's it doing to churches? I mean, so are you seeing people that are buying into liberation theology and social justice and all the rest in the church, even conservative churches, maybe?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question because it, to me, it's difficult to say because from my point of view, there's a disconnection between the spiritual and the material, between the church and the secular life. So, in my experience, most churches are focused on their own objectives, philosophy or statement of faith or purposes. Um, but there is right now more interest in politics from certain circles. There are some Christians wanting to go to Congress and Senate and so on. But most of the time, churches are very self centered and they don't talk a lot about politics or worldview. In fact, I have been in churches that the government gives them the money to build a church or so on, and it's like a favor from them through some politician. Um, but I think there's still a big disconnection. It's not like in the U.S. that people have that mindset, as far as I understand, in connecting that everything is interconnected.
Well, even in the United States, people aren't always connecting it. We have the full spectrum is represented here. You have some people that are, we need to mix politics and theology together, whether that's, right politics, left politics, being conservative or liberal. You have some people that don't want to have anything to do with it. You have some people
Mm.
who think they're not being political when they're being very political. We witness that most
Yeah,
with issues coming sort of from the Black Lives Matter, where
yeah,
they would say, well, I could say the phrase, but I'm not joining the movement. Well, you can't separate the phrase and the movement. Or all the COVID restrictions, where now we're starting to see it was a deeply influential political movement. And we run into it here too. We
yeah,
just have a lot more um, social media voice that makes it
yeah,
look like
yeah.
there sometimes is a little bit more continuity. But it's
The
interesting that
other,
you talk
yeah,
about that. It's something that's facing both North and South America right
yeah.
now.
The other thing about that is interesting is probably because how our countries were structured from their inception is that here maybe culturally the people, society, people, the government says something, people don't care.
Mm.
Like the government says, establishes a law, but it will not enforce it. For example, they require the vaccine certificate to go to the cinema, to the theater. I happened to be twice in the theater. They didn't ask for it. So it is as if they say this, they don't enforce it, and down businesses and people believe and act in a different way. So probably because of corruption, but people don't believe in, in policy. So maybe that's
It's
another
funny.
thing that,
That's
yeah,
something else we've ran into. The exact same thing where there are certain things, you make a law, but I found here in the United States at first, people like say with the vaccines and all the masks and all that, people would kind of follow it until they just said, all right, we're done with it. And businesses got
yeah,
sick and tired of policing everybody for it. And it's interesting to see, different parts of the country react a lot different. You go to our nation's capital, DC. I mean, they're going to really police it. But then you go to, other areas outside of the urban areas, and they're not going to police it. The people just, they're
yeah.
not going to live by these sort of tyrannical laws. Now, I want to change and talk to you about something just related to the church before we get into some of your personal things. What is the basic history of the church in South America? We know that obviously when you see sort of the Spanish settling into South
Yeah.
America, they brought a lot of Roman Catholicism. But could you give us sort of like a 1 minute overview of the church history of South America, sort of how it started, what are its main points, and how they got to where we're at today? I know that's a big question, but just kind of a bird's eye view.
Do my best. But as you say, mostly it's Catholicism that came, the Spanish conquest and so on. That's in history, and there was this exchange for gold and the cross. Actually, I was doing missions in the state or department called Chocó, and in one of the biggest church in the center, because everything is like in Spain. There's the city and there's the park, what we call the park, and the church in the center. And in the background in the church, it's this indigenous people, and then it's a big painting, a bit fresco, the indigenous people and the Spanish offering a sword or a glass, a mirror in exchange for their gold. I thought that was very interesting,
Hmm.
having that in that very um, center of that church in that area, because that's what really happened. But back in the 1800s, there were some British missionaries, that Baptists and some Presbyterian, that came, first missionaries in Colombia. Some of them helped in bringing the Bible in Spanish to the country. Some had, as far as I know in history, they had some association with the Catholic Church in order to let the Bible come down to the people.
So that's about
But
the time that you would have seen the scriptures given to the people. What was that? The 1800s, you said, right in there?
1800s,
Okay.
middle 1800s or so, yeah. But back in my grandparents tell me that in the 40s, I think actually 50s, the mass was still being performing in Latin. And there's an interesting book that also narrates the persecution from Catholics to Protestants in Colombia in the 40s and the 50s, and they were called the Separate Brothers. Um, but in the 70s and the 80s, there was more explosion for Christianity charismatic churches. Until now, I think the growth has been really big in the 80s, and there's mega churches everywhere. Unfortunately, the Reformed tradition is very low. I think it's lower than the 2% in take if you take all Christianity in Colombia. So that's basically it. And I think early 2000s, there were some American seminaries that came here, like Men's and I think others. Uh, and the Reform faith is being awakened more interest until now.
That's interesting because,
I hope that answers your question.
yeah, it really
Sort
does. I mean,
of.
it seems like, let me see if I can summarize and tell me if I got it correct or not. So, generally, they were, an indigenous group throughout South
Yep.
America. And you also saw the Spanish come and they tried to reach out to these indigenous groups. Now, it seems like it might have been more by sword for gold than it was anything else. And I
Yeah.
assume there was significant pushback and with it from if it was anything like it was the United States and you read general history. But was it until about the 1800s? Is that when they started to see the first Protestant missionaries coming in? Was several
Yeah.
several hundred years after, the first people started to colonize.
Yeah, as far as my understanding, yes. Because again, there was they lots of indigenous people, and the Catholic Church was dominating religion in the country. And it's fair to say that indigenous people, they used to sacrifice human sacrifice, and they worship the sun and all of that. So in a way, it wasn't totally bad, the Catholic Church. But yeah, as far as I'm concerned, the history, what I've read, middle 1800s, real missionaries were starting coming here. That's very late. I mean, I always think, well, in Europe they were reforming, we were being conquered.
It was interesting because when I go to South America in certain respects, the few times I've been there, it still feels like the Reformation is taking off. Like it just never really got started, almost like South America skipped
Yeah,
over because, Europe had the Reformation, the United States brought the Reformation. But given the fact that there was oceans in the way and landlocked, it seems as though God brought Reformation years later. Is that right? I
yeah,
mean, am I correct
yeah.
in
The
that?
the, the exception though might be San Andres, San Andres Island. That's more reformed. That's more Christian-like area, because that's an island in the coast in Colombia. And I know people that live there and that have written books of history about it. More reformed people from the US and the UK came to that area of Colombia, but in the interior in Colombia, it took a while.
So what does the reformation of churches look like now in Colombia? I mean, what is it specifically looking like as you see Protestant reformers coming into that country? What do they have to address now? What are their main issues that they're having to deal with to bring reformation to the church in
Yeah.
South America?
I think it's very premature, the reform movement here. It's very new. As you say, it didn't really start off in Colombia until recently. Right now, the Reformation is addressing more the intellectual part, the education, through seminars, uh, schools, and so on, to the point that it can be an area of opportunity to balance or integrate other areas in Christian life and church life. Right now, they are addressing more the doctrines of grace, which is interesting because sometimes is more focused than it should be in those doctrines. So it focuses a lot on the doctrines of grace, predestination, and so on. Um, the speaking of tongues, no longer the case, and
So
all
they're trying
that.
to deal with like the Pentecostal issues and then also the
Yeah,
Roman Catholic issues. And it's interesting because, in the United States, we also had like indigenous groups that when people first started coming over, but we weren't first founded by Catholics. We were founded by Protestants. And that
it's a big
held a really,
difference.
it made a really big difference in the way that things were structured and how Christianity was first perceived and, like how people responded to it. And, one thing that is really interesting, and I think it would be really beneficial for some of our listeners, is that you guys have some big name individuals who have been doing ministry in Medellin. I mean,
Yeah,
big ministry. Some
yeah, it's a
United.
really
I mean,
big
who are some of
name.
the big ones that you've worked with or you've seen since you've
Uh,
been in?
for There's two names that comes to my mind. It's Stephen Lawson. He's been here a few times, preaching and teaching. Richard Pratt from Third Millennium Ministries. He's been here too, and many others. I mean, Dr. Don Gallardi, Douglas Clawson. There's a lot of really good names,
You had
and
Joel
they
Beakey. I know he's
Joel
been
Beak
down
has been
there.
here. Joel Beakey,
Sam, uh,
Sam Waldron.
Sam Waldron was down. I mean, You've had a lot
Yeah.
of people coming down there. I mean, what are the effects of this? I mean, as they're speaking into churches, are people zealous for the scriptures and the ministries that they're bringing and really
Yeah, I
integrating it
think
into?
one thing is that I think people is hungry. The church is hungry because, well, first of all, most Christian Reformed churches grow by transition. People come from other churches. It's not usually the case, new believers, but they come from other churches. So they were kind of tired and sick of the charismatic movement in which everything was music and a really, really short conference of, you're the champion and all that. And now they are hungry to learn. So we absorb like a sponge everything. So that's very positive. And I think that's in my experience, one of the things that American professors really enjoy is the reception, the Q&A sessions, people interested, people really focused on learning. In a way, I think it's a revival. Okay, people really zealous for learning to clarify truths of Scripture and the gospel and Christianity.
It really is a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
You go to different churches here in the United States, and there's a lot of apathy. People just kind of don't care.
Mm.
In many respects, we are a post-Christian culture, the phrase that we
Yeah.
hear. And do you think that Colombia is a post-Christian culture?
I don't think so. I think that even when people leave like atheists, the culture is really dominated by Christian values. Um, so I wouldn't consider my country in South America a post-Christian country, perhaps post-Catholic. And I
See,
think
that's a
that's one
big
of the
difference. That's
reasons.
a big difference right
Yeah,
there. Post-Christian versus post-Catholic, because
yeah,
I mean, people can get into the church history nuances of that, but the mindsets and the issues that you discuss can be significantly different. And
yeah. That's one of the things that I think, and I think some people have said this too, is that the Pope is South American because number one in Europe, people don't care. In the U.S., it's a Christian culture, but in South America, there's still a market for Christianism, for Christianity, to put it that way. So yeah,
can you explain to me this whole idea? It is interesting with the Pope being from South America. I mean, what are the real effects of that for somebody who's not from South America? What does it really mean to say the Pope is from South America? Like, how does that affect his decisions and his outlook on policies within the Catholic Church? Flesh that out for me just a little bit.
well, yeah, I believe that people don't really care that much. I don't think he's that influential as Paul II was. I think the current Pope is a good thing that he's South American in terms of that the Catholic Church seems to have to recover um, believers and people because like I said, there's still a market here in South America for Catholics. And the other thing is that the evangelical church is really growing. They're a really powerful voice in South America. So maybe that becomes a threat to the Catholics. But I think the Pope sometimes he says good stuff. Sometimes he really screws up, and
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
don't
It's
think
interesting because, I mean, I even have some people that would consider themselves Catholic here and they don't even know what to do with this Pope. I mean, I kind of
no.
joke that I'm going to start giving some of them nicknames of Martin Luther and the way they respond to this current Pope.
You
But,
know, yeah. And one
but
thing
here's what
before,
I found.
sorry,
Oh,
okay.
sorry.
Yeah, no, very quick, sorry to interrupt you there, is that Catholic people right now are more open to have conversations with evangelicals. It's not like years before, back 10 years ago, people were very close. I'm Catholic, do not knock my door, tarara. They are now more open because they seem to find a common ground in light of how our society is more corrupt morally than before.
That's interesting because,
Yeah.
with the current Pope right now, it was interesting how it was sold into the United States that he's this forward looking global person. He's not that sort of stuck in the mud, sort of hard, cold individual that they had before. And I think a lot of the media presented it that way because he is more socialist and they're
Yes.
socialist, and they just viewed him so positively. But it's also interesting when you talk about sort of this Catholic Protestant interaction that has taken place in South America, because we faced the exact same thing probably 40 years ago here in the United States. And we had a movement that was called Evangelicals and Catholics Together, which I really
Yeah,
wasn't in favor of. In fact, I
I
took the side
remember
of Sproul and MacArthur,
MacArthur, and I think
and Alistair
Alistair
Begg was with
Beck.
it,
Yeah,
and D. James Kennedy, where, we don't need to have this coming together with it. We need to be very solid upon the fact that justification by faith alone is an essential of the gospel. And
yeah,
to deny that is key to, in one sense, apostasy. And it's interesting because we faced it years before. And I hope that there are a few Kennedys and Sproul's and MacArthur's that won't allow that locking of hands, because it'll blur the gospel
yeah.
in Colombia. Now, what do you think with this when you've been working in missions, you've done translation work, and you've done this with different teachers and speakers throughout Colombia? But given your experience with missions, what is your perspective about the future of missions in Colombia? What's that going to look like? Kind of where'd they come
Yeah.
from, and what's it going to look like?
Well, I think in Colombia it has been a welcoming place for missions. I think the current policies and peace are very beneficial for missionaries to come, Americans from other parts of the world. Um, I think it's great opportunities. There's great opportunities to for missions to do many things here, from planting churches to social work and so on. I work about 4 years running a ministry on missions in a very poor area in Colombia, plus my time in teaching at a school. And I think one of the big areas of improvement, and I really want to say failure of American missionaries and others, I don't want to limit them to North Americans, but most are North Americans, is that sometimes it seems that they want to impose a program. And sometimes for Latinos, it seems like they have a boss, okay? The missionary is the boss. And the negative consequences of that is that sometimes, as far as my experience, it creates a dependency, an entitlement mindset from people, not only from financially, but also intellectually. Now we depend on American professors to learn about scripture, theology, and the Bible. And it's been years training thousands of students. So what's happening with those students that are being graduated, that graduate and they have been exposed to all this. So I think when I think needs to be a teamwork, like an inner exchange of culture, and keeping in mind, and I'm quoting the book When Helping Hurts from Carbet and Fickert, that they say we both need reconciliation, both the missionary and the person who is being the recipient of the missions, whether it's social work or a church or teaching or so on. So both need to learn and work out together. So I think that's a big area I see that our missionaries need to learn to be
It's
more
inter-
open.
it's
Yeah,
interesting that you say that, because if you spend enough time going to seminaries and Bible colleges, and you have friends that move overseas, and they run into a very similar thing where people become very dependent upon the missionaries, when there almost needs to be we're going to come here, we're bringing the gospel, but there has to be a transfer of leadership and an
yeah.
ownership of
And
responsibility.
and I understand it's not easy because some cultures, some honor and shame cultures like ours, we are used to be told what to do, and we're not used to be asked, "Tell me about your dreams. Tell me about your goals." So we're kind of waiting for someone to tell us what to do, who we are in terms of identity and so on. So I understand it's maybe difficult for missionaries to do that exchange because they don't they don't understand that part of the culture. But that book really recommends a lot of good points on what to do. Really good recommendations on what to do. The authors they share some experiences in Africa, and I think they're really good. Um, but I think it's tough. I don't want to be judgmental with them. Uh, but again, if if some missionaries and teachers are aware of this, they can teach it to the locals, and then the locals can become aware of it and be more clear as we communicate with the missionaries.
Yeah, that makes sense. I know that that's always a big issue that people have to overcome with missions work. Now, let me press on missions a little bit more in in South America. You can help me with this. Where would be some of the good places in Colombia if people wanted to invest, sort of like where would they plant a church at? Is it better in an urban area or a rural area? What are the strengths and weaknesses of both?
Yeah. Well, I think that there's good churches in the downtown areas. I believe both in Bogota and Medellin and in the coast. I think the coast has really, really good Reformed churches that they have been around for years. But I think a good place is the rural area because in the rural area you have people that they are not very educated in terms of academics, and they don't know a lot of the Christian theological jargon that we used to implement sometimes. And in these areas, people are very open, very family oriented, to so to speak.
Would those people
And
consider themselves Roman Catholic? Most likely.
yeah, yeah,
Now,
most
let me
likely.
ask you this, because this is always something I've wondered. So I know that like Roman Catholicism is very dominant in South America, much different than it is in the United States. If somebody didn't associate as a Roman Catholic and they weren't a member of a Protestant church and they're in a rural area, would they ever associate with any of the older historic religions that would have been in South America?
Um, well, that's an interesting question, but I don't think there's a problem. I mean, if somebody's interested in learning, and maybe the impact will have to do with how the church is being planted. How they are implementing this Bible studies, inviting the community, talking with people, really open to questions, not pressuring people to become members of or that thing. But I think people will be open. I mean, most old people uh, from their 60s and on are more like Catholic, their church and the mass and so on. But other people is more open. So I think that would
Can
be
I
a
can
good
I
opportunity.
rephrase it just to see a little? Do you have any of the sort of older religions that would have been in South America, say even prior to when the Spanish
Oh,
came? Are they
okay.
still there and in different places? And would people associate with sort of those more
There,
tribal religions?
yeah. Well, there are communities, but this may sound weird, but they are more like they're not in the city, in the civilized world. They're in the outside of the country, and sometimes they have their own laws, their own privileges by the country. But in the city or in a normal city, you wouldn't see people
You're not going to
associated with
run
those
into it.
religions.
Do
No.
you have people going to the rural areas to reach that kind of group, or is it maybe too dangerous, or is it or just not people aren't doing it, or
No, I think it's been a while since I don't see people doing it. Uh, I think there are missions doing it, but it's not very common. It's not very common. Most missions are focused on the city, in the inner city or the downtown.
yeah, we run into a very similar thing here. The United States, most people want to go to a big city because, there's a lot of people there and there's a lot of things going on. And we have a lot of rural churches, but given the history of the United States, we have a lot of Native American reservations around where there are these plots of land that were given to Native
Uh,
Americans, and you will still see a lot of the older sort of Native American
yeah.
religions there. And you'll find people here and there that will have little expressions, just like cultural overtones as you
Mhm.
get closer to it. But it's pretty similar here. I mean, you could go there. I think all in all, you would be safe. I don't know what the reception to the gospel would be, and if there are a lot of churches, but I didn't know it's different. North America and South
Yeah.
America are just so different in the way that those things functioned
Yeah.
and interacted.
That reminds me, probably 6 years ago, I was with a friend. He was planning a church in the very rural area in the mountain in Antioquia, and we were evangelizing. We had to walk maybe an hour going down, very very warm. And these people from a little house, they were dedicated to they cultivate the soil, and so they would live for potatoes. They never attended not even a Catholic church. So these were people right now that they don't know anything about any church, but they opened the doors to talk
They're like an
and preach
unreached
the
people
gospel.
group in that sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So
So I know as we're looking here, I know you've done a lot of different translating work and you've worked with different schools. How can somebody get involved in that? How did you get involved in it?
oh yeah, that's funny. Uh because I yeah, when I started attending a Reformed Baptist church, I was very impressed because they were bringing a lot of Americans to preach and teach. So sometimes they didn't have a translator. I wasn't, and I don't have a translation certificate. And one day they were like, "Hey, the service is going to start. We don't have a translator." So I said, "Okay, well, I'll give it a shot." And, and then yeah, I kind of became known. It didn't went so bad, and I also wanted to make friends and build relationships. Um, that eventually gave me some projects to translate a couple books, and that's how I got involved in it. What I have seen in the schools here is that if you kind of like English and you're very passionate, they give you the opportunity to learn and to be there and do it. But I have to say, interpreting live theological teachings, especially if it's someone like you, is really tough because the language and the words are very academic,
They're
and you
technical. They
need
are. Yeah.
and you need number one, you need to be very familiar with the Bible so that you can associate the right words with whatever version the professor is using. And number two, you need to also read and understand some philosophical and theological words from the English again to associate them properly to the culture.
Yeah, that's always the difficulty is that, I for example, I mean, I took a few years of Spanish in high school, but I don't know any theological Spanish. I barely know enough Spanish now to, be able to hold any kind of a conversation with it. And I just think how much you've had to learn. I mean, you can speak conversational English very well, but it's a big jump to go from conversational English to academic and theological
Uh,
and but here's actually the thing that's most impressive to me. A lot of people who get into reading historical theology and the reformers and the Puritans, even if English is their first language, they find that literature difficult because it's like, I don't know if you have like old Spanish and newer Spanish, but we have older forms of English and newer forms
yeah,
of English. And you read it, you're like, what in the world are these guys saying? And it
yeah. The
becomes
other day,
difficult.
the other day, I bought a copy of the Geneva Bible, and
It's like a
and I
different
talked
form
to
of English, isn't it?
yeah, and I talked to a friend, a professor, and he said, "Why did you do that?" And I said, and I thought, yeah, why would I do that? I was just curious. I've been a very curious person. I want to learn if, and my wife says, you're obsessive. You you're thinking something, you have to do it no matter what.
It's
So I'm
funny.
very
My wife says
curious.
the exact same thing.
Yeah,
She's always like, whenever you do something, you don't just dip your toe in. You want to jump all the way in. And I
there
mean,
you
there
go.
could be good things and bad things from it. And this, I mean, I'm not going to fault you for buying another translation from the
Yeah.
Bible and that and going through
So,
it.
but the I think one of the advantages is that one of the most popular Bible uh, translations is the Reina Valera. The Reina Valera 1960, which is still in use, is very similar to the King James, to the
Okay.
1611 King James. But if you go back and read the Reina Valera 1909, which I'm most familiar to, interestingly, that's the Bible I got when I came to Christ, and I still read that version because I think it's more poetic and has really, really nice expressions. It's less as if they took King James here, let's start translating the Spanish Bible.
Yeah.
So if you do that, you get you get a lot of key things for English to understand and translate.
Okay. And that's always interesting. I know that, there's a lot that goes into translation work. And now you were the last time I was there, we'll see if this has continued or not. You were trying to teach your son how to do translation work. How's that been going?
Well, yeah, sometimes I pay him to do me translations, short translations when I got some customers. Yeah, he does it. Uh, he doesn't get he doesn't complicate his life like I do. He goes to Google
Well,
and then he start working on it and editing. He's more like an editor and not
hey, that's a good
translation.
thing. There's you gotta
Yeah,
find different tools to the trade to get it done. I remember
yeah,
when I was down there, we went to a church and you were doing some translating up at the front, and he was sitting next to me, and somebody said some kind of phrase, and I could tell he had that moment that anybody who's trying to translate has of, oh, how am I going to actually get this into another language? And he looked at me and he goes, he basically just said, and I don't remember what he said, just some very straightforward sentence. And I kind of
yeah.
laughed because I was like, we've all been there. We know that the gist, you might not get every word and every detail of it, but it's a process. And I'm
It
really
is.
thankful that you're working with him because, as time goes on, he goes from sentences like that to one day he could very well be translating for speakers and
Yeah,
missionaries coming into South America, having that sort of
yeah.
global vision for it.
I think he's got the blessing to enjoy different friends from North America, and that's been influential for him. He did one little project from RC Explorer, Little Story for Christmas, as a homeschool project. And, he's good at English, but I have to recognize that he's more into Japanese now. He's in Japanese classes. That's what he likes.
Seriously, he wants to do
Yeah, and
Japanese more than English.
yeah, and that's
That's
okay. I
interesting.
mean,
We have a lot of
yeah,
people here that are wanting to learn Japanese in the United States. They say Japanese is one of the most difficult languages like in the world to learn.
I
But
think life is too short.
oh yeah, I couldn't do
Yeah,
it. I'm like, nope. I keep
yeah,
like my wife's really good at speaking Spanish, but for me, I mean, I had to do my research languages throughout school and all this, and I want to become fluent in Spanish, but it's like, man, how do I find the time to do it? And
yeah.
that's because there's a lot of people that even speak Spanish in the United States, but Japanese, I don't think I'm going to do. I just don't think I'm going
No,
to have a
not
whole lot
not
of use
not
for it.
not Japanese or German.
Yeah,
Not at all. But the thing is with Spanish is that you got different accents and words. Even in Colombia, that's the other thing that touches on missions too, because in Colombia we have like three different cultures with different nuances, and the language changes. If you go to Argentina, Spanish changes. So I think that's a challenge for English speaking people that want to learn Spanish too, is that
can
the different accents.
can you tell the people this story if you feel comfortable with it? You told me about a trip that you took to Mexico and how you were speaking Spanish in
Yeah,
Mexico. How did that happen? What you remember that?
that that's very funny. Yeah, I was in a business trip for a company I was working with in Mexico, and they shipped me to Cancun because there was a summit with some Chinese providers. And then, okay, we got some time off. I was to get to know the place, and I was just, exploring, and I was speaking, asking for some things. And one of the guys said, "Hey, you're Colombian. I got some stuff you might be interested in." And he began talking about Pablo Escobar and all that. And I said, you know what? No more Spanish for now.
So you're walking
from
around
that,
Mexico speaking English because they're connecting your accent with Colombia and Pablo
yeah,
Escobar. And oh, that's so funny. I
yeah.
mean, that's
And
just
my accent is from Medellin, it's very particular. So they know where I'm from. So that was a very
that
fun
is
experience.
hilarious. I remember when you told me that. I've told other people, I was like, that's one of the funniest things that I've seen. So as we close up here, tell us about your YouTube channel. I know you've been doing a lot of work with it. I mean, how can they find it and look at some of the videos that you're
Mhm.
doing that you've
Yeah,
started with YouTube recently?
I have that channel years ago. But after once the pandemic started, I found another job, and I was, fe- I say this, I had that fire, that passion for teaching. So I wanted to teach. I want to teach something,
Yes.
and we're here locked down in our house. So I want to teach something. So I look at my library and I said, "Well, I remember that every book I read, I highlight what I like, my favorite phrases, what I think I'll use later on. I know where to find it. So I'll come back to those books and find those quotes from any author." So I started this channel doing reviews, reviewing books, and I had the idea to review books that are not yet in Spanish, probably will not be in Spanish. So I wanted to give people an idea of what this book teaches, and introducing and inserting some comments of my own. Um, so yeah, the vision for my channel is talking about worldview. It's Cosmovision with a Z, like Zion, worldview, in which we review books and around that topic of worldview, and not only Christian books, some other books. Like right now, I'm working on a psychology book on focus on Batman. So
Okay.
I'm trying to apply some of the principles that John Frame teaches in his book Theology in the Movies to this book and the movies, and kind of showing people, hey, you don't have to satanize stuff. You can discern, you can learn how to extract and dissect movies and find positive um, values in the spectrum of what the gospel is. So yeah, you can find me on Cosmovision, and that's kind of the idea of the book, of the
Okay.
channel.
What we'll do is we'll actually put a link in the description for this video to your YouTube page. So if people watch this, they can go there and follow the link and see everything that you've done. So I got one final question here before we sort of wrap things up. We all have to consider the fact that we're not going to live forever, and
Yeah,
we are going to pour our lives out for the sake of the gospel and for different things. So when you die, what do you want to be remembered for?
I love that question, though my wife doesn't, because I think about that every day. And one day I found a website that you have the stone and you can put your name on it.
Oh
You kind of
no.
so I was kind of trying to, what phrase should I put there if I am the funeral? What I would like it to read.
You know what I'm going to put on
And
mine? I'm going to put, I told you I was sick. That's a quote from R.C. Sproul, by the way.
yeah, no, I think I would like to be remembered for my faith, no matter what happens, no matter what challenges, no matter what people say, how the world becomes, how crazy, how terrifying it becomes. I want to be remembered by my faith in Christ, how it really changed my life forever, and how I wanted to bring that about to my children and grandchildren.
Amen. Well,
Yeah,
again, Anderson, thank you so much. Whenever I think of you, I think of a person who is deeply committed to the cause of the gospel and the work of the church in South America. And at some point, I definitely want to continue this conversation as time goes
Absolutely.
on. But let me tell you, anybody who's listening to this, whether you're in South America or in the United States, if you're looking for somebody who you want to do or have do translation work for you, but even I would say this, if you ever were looking for somebody to come and be a public speaker for one of your events here or there, Anderson's your guy. He's definitely somebody who God has really blessed and equipped for the sake of gospel ministry. And Anderson, we're thankful for you. And if there's anything we can do for you, let us know. Okay.
Well, Bill, thank you for again. It's been a nice time. As I've told you before, I really enjoyed teaching with you. I love that you include your karate lessons to some
Exactly.
apologetic teaching,
Exactly.
and
Do all
that's
things
great.
unto the glory of God. And some people need to meet Jesus in different ways, you know?
Yeah,
I mean, I
yeah.
kind of joke, we have this karate class up here and these different martial arts classes, and we hold them in a gym in a church. And I say we need to get a little sign that says, regardless of what happens, we promise you will cry out to Jesus.
Exactly. That's a good one. No, thank you. It's been a pleasure, a privilege speaking with you. You're doing a great job in your videos. I love it. And sometimes I use them and I watch them a couple times to take my notes and and learn more and implement for my videos. And I look forward to teach with you again in the near
Yeah.
future.
Whenever all this stuff kind of goes
Yeah.
beyond us, and we'll definitely be traveling down, I'm not really worried about the virus. I'm more worried about all the politicians that might put all these regulations on us from travel and can
Yeah.
you get in and out of countries and all the rest. But again, thank you, Anderson. We really appreciate it. We'll put the contact information in the description for the video below. And I just want to encourage all of you, please reach out, watch his videos. And if you need translation work or speakers anywhere, Anderson's your guy to look to. So again, thank you, Anderson.
Thank you, Ben.